Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with Mystic Gen Mara, your host for this evening's video, and we are going back to our series Occult and Crochet. So we're going to start off with our crochet part. This is one I've been working on for a minute. Unfortunately, it took me forever to finish, but this is the finality. This is the center of it, but it comes all the way out to this very, very nice shading going on. It's very lightweight. It's a cotton blend, so it's not heavy at all. Has a very nice drape according to the way that the yarn falls. So finally got that one finished. I've got a few other things I got started. So back at the live streams. It's been a minute. So we're gonna hop into the back in time machine, and we're gonna visit a monarch that really helped steer a very broad section of the world, actually, but he also redirected some attention back onto the witches, which is why we are talking about him here. That is going to be King James of England, King James the First of England, but also his name is King James the Sixth, VI, of Scotland. So he has a very long and sordid history, and I'm going to go over his youth and the witch hunting aspects. His political intrigue and the actions that are tied to him are not the focus, but you could literally do hours and hours and hours of streams on this man. There is so much information out there, and I literally scratched the surface. I've been working on this one for a minute, but I kept putting stuff in, taking stuff out, switching stuff around. It's been a journey, and so it's probably not the most thorough, but that's not the point. I want to introduce certain points and why I'm even bringing him up in the first place, which is one of his works that he did. So this is not going to be a short video, unfortunately, because of the amount of information that's here. So we'll start off at the beginning. King James was born James Charles Stuart on June 19th of the year of our Lord 1566. He was born to a rather interesting historical figure in her own right, Mary, Queen of Scots, and he was her only son. His father was Henry Stuart, the Lord of Darnley, and here's where the intrigue starts, literally from birth. James's parents were cousins, close, but I'm not exactly sure how far. It's not referenced in any of the stuff that I could find. They were both very Catholic, and that was not very popular. Scotland was a Protestant country at the time, so them being Catholic, not so great. And Henry Stuart even at one point made a move against his own wife while she was pregnant with James. Like, the intrigue and the political stuff was fascinating as I dug through this. I got distracted a few times. Through the family of Henry and Mary, they actually both came from the line of Henry VII, who is the King of England and the Lord of Ireland. Because of the chaos of the monarchy of that day, the bloodline that he actually is attached to set him up to be the heir to 3 different thrones. England, Scotland, and Ireland. So there's a lot of moving parts here. That's the reason I'm like, I'm going to stick to the basics. To start, at birth, he was given the title Duke of Rothesay. With that, he was also named the Prince of Scotland and the Great Steward of Scotland. James was baptized under a Catholic priest in 1566. And I threw this in here because I thought it was gross, and I figured if I had to read it, so you guys have to hear it. There was a gross custom that Mary, thankfully, refused to let the priest do. The custom of the day, at a baptizing of a baby, the priest would spit in the baby's mouth to seal the blessing. I'm not kidding. I double-checked that on a couple of spots because I was like, that's what they used to do. In my opinion, Mary was very smart to refuse this aspect of the ritual. I still can't quite figure out what the purpose was, but I'll say this a few times through here because it's amazing how much is there. If you ever get bored and you want to really get a novel that's real life, like Game of Thrones type thing, go through the history of the UK, England, Scotland, Ireland, all of that, Wales, toss that in, and just try to like map the royals. It's a trip. But with James here, he actually took over the Scottish throne with just after his first year of life. It is said that he accepted the throne at the age of 13 months. Congratulations, child, here's a country. But from what I could see, it looks like the lords wanted Mary out of the way as well. So basically, she bore James. They forced her to abdicate the throne. But there were a series of regents that ruled until James could take over. But why did a 13-year-old inherit the throne? What was going on that drove Mary out of the situation? Well, this gets into more of our intrigue. James's father was murdered in February of 1567. James inherited his father's titles at that time, which was the Duke of Albany and the Earl of Ross. Trying to track the names gets tricky, so in May, his mother remarried. 3 months later, why not? And her new hubby was James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. This earl was actually suspected, and kind of some hush-hush talks, of offing Henry in the first place. Wonder why she married the Earl of Bothwell. Well, the Protestants of the country didn't like the situation, didn't really like Mary, didn't really like the Earl either, and in June of that same year, she was overthrown and locked in a tower. Not really. She was actually locked in a castle, which was the Loch Leven castle, and a month later, she was forced to fully abdicate the throne publicly to her son, James, at the time around 13 months old. This is when the regents started to rule. James was raised in the house of Earl and the Countess of... the house of the Earl and Countess of Mar. I can't even read my own notes. In this house, he was raised to be a very Protestant person and was actually a member of the Church of Scotland, which was a very Protestant style church. I believe it was Calvinist. If I didn't write that down, but I'm pretty sure that's who that was. His life was not great at this time. This is one of the teachers that he had was exceptionally aggressive, and it was said that he would subject James to severe beatings for minor infractions in scholastic achievements. Great teacher, right? Oddly enough, it was also said of this teacher that he instilled the love of literature and the spoken word to James. I'm not sure how getting whipped like that makes you want to read books better and speak more eloquently, but it must have done something. During this exact time, Mary, being imprisoned in a castle, had escaped. So between the ages of 2 years old and 19, James never saw his mom at all. She was literally locked away. But when he was about 3, somewhere in there, she escaped Scotland and fled to England, who her family lives there anyway, so why not? And it was said that she was causing quite a stir trying to take back her throne. Many attempted, some successful assassination attempts were made, and these were just some of the minor ones. The assassinations were kind of the most interesting ones. One person was poisoned at a party where some of her people had been seen. Another one had been stabbed. There was some military action at one point taken. It was just it pretty much was consistent for quite a few years there. But we're not talking about Mary. The regents ruled in James's stead until James was around 12 or 13, and that's when he was kind of forced into a more active role in his community, or his land, I should say. It was at the age of 17, 18, though, was when he really took the reins of power away from those guys. And personally, I'm kind of curious how those regents felt when he started pushing them out of the way and taking back the control. To put it mildly, they weren't really super happy about the situation, but the parade of regents ended with the Earl of Lennox, because there was 4 total, but they cycled through. One in particular was a victim of Mary's rage. The other 2 just kind of passed on, not a big thing. But it was after the Earl of Lennox, and there's a little gossip we'll get into here in a second on that. But after the Earl of Lennox was removed, forced out, James basically said, I'm taking over. We're done playing this game with regents. I don't like what you guys are doing. I'm going to deal with this. So he took over the whole kingdom. And a few banishments, denouncing the writers of a former teacher or two, passing a few royal acts to chase other people out, and he got the majority of his land under his control. That particular window of time between the ages of 12 to about 19 had pages and pages and pages and websites, and you start going into the bibliographies. There are so many things written about this man, I can't even start. I literally am like plucking a sentence per page type of a thing. There's so much there. So if you really want to see, like I said, real life type stuff, go check that out. And mind you, this all happened before he was even 30. We're still very young at this point. So a little court gossip for you. There seems to be some interesting little things that were poked about around James. That last regent, the one that was pushed out of the country, Earl of Lennox, he was a Protestant convert. And I couldn't really pinpoint what he was before that. I'm assuming just general person. But he was distrusted heavily by the local religious leaders. They made quite a few accusations, and it became quite the scandal, about how the Earl and the young king acted towards each other, flirtatious looks, random touching, things like that the church didn't really agree with at the time. And it was speculated by some of these church leaders that the Earl of Lennox was trying to know the young king carnally. I'll let you fill in the blanks. This led to the leaders basically locking the king in a castle and chasing Lennox out of the land and banishing him. This is where James was like, okay, enough with your shenanigans. I'm taking things over. We're done here. And from that point, he would remain the sole ruler of his kingdom. And he also tended to be more in the company of men. There was quite the scandal, and the biographers that I was referencing, one would say nothing came of it. The other one was like, it was kind of something the kings used to do back in the day. So I just thought it was kind of a wild, the Earl of Lennox wasn't young. He was like in his 40s or 50s. And at the time he took over, King James was only around 16. So that's creepy even in today's standards. But back in the day, it was kind of accepted. Not within the church, but everywhere else it was. Still weird. So because he was so stuck with men, he kind of didn't show interest in women, which the church cheered because, you're celibate, yay. But he also knew that to secure his legacy and to actually keep hold of the country, he needed a wife. So this would lead James to finding and marrying in 1589, and he was around 25 at the time. He married his wife, who was Anne of Denmark, and again, this age thing in the royals at this time was insane. He was around 25, she was 14. I had to look that up like 3 times because I was like, cannot be true. But she was the 14-year-old daughter of the Danish king Frederick II. There was a proxy wedding, didn't know what that was, had to look it up. So James went to the priest, recited his vows, and there was a representative from Denmark who was there reciting her vows, so they were married by proxy. In other words, she was still in Denmark at the time. Such a weird way to do things, the royals back in the day. But this is where we introduce James into why I'm talking about him. In 1589, Anne left Denmark, around Copenhagen specifically, and started to sail towards Scotland. A very violent storm, which was kind of common for the area, came up and drove the ship actually to the shores of Norway. James was very upset by this when he finally received word because his wife still hadn't shown up. And so he set sail with a retinue of 300 plus persons, multiple ships to collect his wife. And during this particular time, Denmark was in the throes of witch trials. They were all over the place during this window of time. So once he got to Denmark, James actually started really getting interested in these witch trials and witch hunting and what was going on in Denmark. So he really got his appetite whet for this. And eventually in 1563 he would pass his own laws, which were simply called the Witchcraft Act of 1563. And this was just an obsession for James. He was convinced, as he continued on his life once him and Anne got back to Scotland. Oops, I have pictures. So here's James, older picture, or painting of James, obviously not a picture. And then these outfits, this was Anne. Like, the humongous hips on it, it's like a dinner plate sitting there. And you know that they still have some of these dresses in museums, so this is actually something they used to wear, which baffles me. But because of his obsession with witchcraft and studying it and trying to figure out how to deal with the witches, he became convinced that the storm that came up against Anne's ship and the very storm that also attacked his ship when he was going to get her was called by witchcraft. And he really was focused on a very specific group of witches, because at this point he was going through witch trials himself, and this one name popped up a couple different times, and this name was Agnes Sampson. Agnes was an old healer woman, herbalist, whatever you want to call her back in the day, but she was being accused of being a witch. Agnes was being accused by another supposed witch who had been under torture, one of the many, I should say, but the one that really solidified her getting nailed was Gillis Duncan. Gillis was under torture as well, and of course pointed the finger at Agnes. She was kind of the last one of the line that pointed at Agnes, so then Agnes got dragged into the court, usually the king's palace, but whatever. She was questioned in front of the king initially, and when I say questioned, if you've watched a few of these, you know that basically means tortured. So she was eventually tossed over to the torturers, the questioners, and her body was shaved to find her witch's mark, because, you know, it was thought that the devil always hid his mark under hair to make it less noticeable to the outside world. Going on that lore, it was said that as long as a non-witch doesn't view the mark, the witch's tongue would remain quiet even under torture. If the mark was ever found, the witch would be compelled to confess immediately. I'm still kind of baffled as to where they figured this nonsense out, because it doesn't make sense to anyone. In poor Agnes's case, though, after that first round of questioning in front of the king, she was, again, handed over to the torturers, and her head was shaven first. Most common place to find the mark apparently was on the head, or it was a way to break down their personality, I'm not sure. But once her head was shaven, they did this torture, where they would wrap the head, especially up here, in multiple rounds of rope and then start to pull it tight, basically constricting the top of your head. The pain from this is thought to be excruciating. Considering the amount of nerves and stuff up there, that's not surprising. But the torturers would continue as they were cranking on her head to shave the rest of her body, and it was said that Agnes's witch's mark were found in her private lady area. Again, I'll let you fill in the blanks. And upon this revealing of the mark, Agnes fell to confession. Couldn't have been because of all the humiliation, the torture, the pain, you know, all that fun stuff. No, it was just the mark. Agnes admitted to calling the wind against King James and his wife using a dead cat. I'm not going into that detail. I could not believe what I read when I read it. It's just nasty. Bleh. Anyway, but the area where this contrary wind that she kept summoning came from happens to be known for these really random winds. It's kind of a thing, happens a lot, even today. Was it witchcraft, or these people putting words in her mouth or torturing her until she said what they wanted to say? I'm going with the latter. It was reported that Agnes would eventually confess directly in front of the king after all that nonsense went on, and after her mark was found. She admitted to attempting to get a piece of the king's clothing over the years so that she could work her dark arts against the king. She claimed the devil offered her and her children a great boon if they would strike at the king. She said that the devil came to her as, again, you got to remember the time periods of these things. Originally it was a black man, then it changed to a dog, and then it was a haystack or a hay pitchfork. I'm not sure how a pitchfork can talk. I'm not questioning it. These people had their own ideas. But the appearings, and most of them will start with either a black man or some kind of canine, and I don't get it. It makes no sense to me. And tonight's kombucha is their seasonal one for, of course, Valentine's Day is coming up. It's pure love. It's blood orange, hibiscus, and rose. It's actually not too bad. But King James was a bit skeptical of her original confession. That's why she got shipped off to the torturers. And even when she came back, he wasn't quite convinced that there was anything to what she was saying. Again, smart man, crazy time. But the king's mind actually was solidified against Agnes once Agnes claimed to know what he and Anne, his wife, had said to each other on their wedding night in a room where it was only the two of them, supposedly. According to James, she said the exact words, verbatim, that they said to each other in their marriage bed. She whispered it into his ear, and this convinced James beyond all question that she was a witch, and by extension, she signed her own death warrant by that confession. She was charged and condemned on 53 counts of witchcraft, demonology, necromancy. The list was extensive, not going into all of that. And this actually led to her death by garrote, which is choking, strangulation. And then her body was tied to a stake and burned to cleanse her soul. Great job, 1591. Good job. Anne and King James, even with all the chaos going on of his hunting and everything, appeared to be rather fertile. But times were really hard back then, so they had to be fertile. He sired with Anne 7 children that lived. She had 3 miscarriages, I believe, and of the 7 born, only 3 would make it into their teen years. Again, life was really rough back in the day. And those were Henry Frederick, Elizabeth, and Charles. Anne, shortly, about 15 years after the death of Agnes, Anne would pass away as well. She wasn't very old, by the way. And she passed away in 1619. But during their marriage, James ascended to the throne of England. After all the witch hunting in Scotland, dealing with a lot of stuff in Ireland, because he had both thrones, his cousin Elizabeth I, she didn't have any kids. And she'd been kind of working out some treaties with her cousin James over the years, so there was a little bit of peace talk going on there. But when she died without an heir, the only viable male heir at the time was James. There were some very, very distant shirt-tail cousins, but they were so far out from the core family, they weren't even considered for the royalty. So James would actually take over England as well in 1603. This would set him up to rule Scotland, England, and Ireland, and he would rule this set of lands for 22 years until his death in 1625. Under King James I, or the 6th, the land of Great Britain became a concrete thing, what we would call basically the United Kingdom today. He would establish a single parliament, and it was very contentious from day one, for both England and Scotland. He would rule Scotland from, the age of 13 months to his death for 57 years. He almost made it to 58. He was like 80 days short, which was the longest of any Scottish monarch. Literature under his guidance flourished, and he was very hungry for words on paper. He loved plays. He loved listening to orators. many great writers stepped into the scene during this window of time. William Shakespeare and Francis Bacon were two of the primary ones. Francis Bacon is an interesting character, which we'll talk about later, because he's not just a writer and a politician, he was also an occultist. So we'll get into him later. It was from his own writings that he came to my attention. And I didn't put two and two together on this until I was in my 30s, and then all of a sudden it clicked. I was like, oh my goodness. He was such a prolific writer, but the reason that I really want to talk about him for this is this little book right here. It is Demonology, and this is an English translation of it, so it's not as cool as the old ones, because the original title was Demon as in Spirit, Daemonologie. So it's spelled completely old world style, and it's I found little clips of it online, and it's just kind of a cool book. I want to sit down and compare the original, the old English version, to this one, because this is written in modern English, so it's not as, to me, as interesting. But this book was published originally in 1597. King James is also responsible for another book that holds very great importance in the modern world, and that is this book right here. He is this King James. And if you were like me, and a lot of people who start off in Christian households, they start off with the King James version of the Bible, whether it was old or new. I started off with the old King James version. It was a gift from my grandmother, and it was a little book. It's still about this big. I still have it. It's wrapped up. It's kept very safe because it's a very old book at this point. I mean, we won't talk about how old I am, but it's an older book, but it's got all of the watercolor paintings, like the Renaissance style paintings, and it is full of the old language. The these, the thous, the saiths, the seeths, the whole thing. And that was actually the original Bible that was written for the common person. Probably the most widespread for the day anyway, we'll put it that way. I use this version here, this red one here, is my New King James, so it's one I usually read now because it's easier for people to understand. But why was this Bible so fascinating, and why was it so groundbreaking for the time? It was really the first from Latin to English translation, because King James believed that words were a way to pass on knowledge and information. Keeping something secret or hidden actually stunted people's abilities to understand. He also thought that if they read this first, the Demonology, that they would be more than willing to do things with the Bible, and that would drive them closer to their spiritual roots, but also help him in his journey to hunt witches. It was a great little side story there. But the last years of King James, after he commissioned the English translation of the Bible, were not that great. He did a lot of really good things for the church and for England and the UK, to be honest with you. There's a lot there that he was doing. But towards the end of his life, he started to drink excessively. We would probably call him an alcoholic today, but most of the royalty at that time was. James suffered from gout, severe gout, and very bad arthritis. It was said that his arthritis could actually keep him in a chair for hours at a time because the pain was so bad. It was also said that he had horrible kidney stones and lost most, if not all, of his teeth. I can imagine the alcohol didn't help with any of that. But his last year of life is actually kind of sad. His power, because of his weakening condition, had been slowly being transferred to his son Charles. In 1625, spring or winter of that year, so January, February, I didn't get the date, James suffered a massive stroke. Shortly thereafter, he contracted dysentery, really nasty little bug-borne illness, and it was the combination of stroke, dysentery eventually led to his death. He was deemed Great Britain's Solomon, like King Solomon from back in the day, by the Bishop John Williams of Lincoln, and I thought that was kind of an accurate concept, considering the amount that I dug into him again, I'm not going over all of that because I don't have that many days in my life that I want to dedicate to one person. But he was such a complex man, and he brought so much in England and Scotland and Ireland together under one banner. And he did a lot of good, ignoring the witchcraft part, but I'm literally scratching the surface with what I've brought forward even here. I want to go over his witch trials and the Witchcraft Act later, because that's a second branch. Get the guy introduced first. Even after he died, though, the people of his lands, the lands, it was said, greatly mourned him, which is kind of surprising considering he was a very flawed man. But the one thing that he did that a lot of his predecessors hadn't done was King James brought peace to the land of Scotland and England. He kept them out of a lot of conflict, and he worked to kind of settle down some of the other stuff that was going on mainland Europe at the time. But as things happen, his son took over after King James left, King Charles, but he got a little too big for his britches, and he started making some claims, started pushing some things, and he failed miserably. He actually was assassinated shortly after ascending to the throne, and it actually set the stage for, from what I could find, one of the bigger civil wars in England and Scotland's history, because Charles kind of overstepped and started pushing where his dad was a scholar and someone who tried to find peaceful ways to deal with things. Charles was a little more aggressive and didn't quite follow in his dad's footsteps, and the people did not like him for that. So, going on after he passed away, his work is what continues to linger on. After his interest in witchcraft was piqued, he was so obsessed for pretty much the rest of his life. There was always some aspect of this that was going on in the background. And this turned into this book here, which is it's called an essay on necromancy and delves into black magic and sorcery. Not a lot to me about necromancy. There's a section in here on necromancy, which is corpse bothering and using the dead for fortune telling and things like that. But it was how it was written that to me was an odd style. I've only read a few books like that when they were way older than this one. It's written in a dialogue form, and I had looked up what style of dialogue. It's called the Socratic dialogue form, so it's basically two people, one asking a question, the other one going on for a while about the answer, filling in backup questions and things like that. In this particular discourse, the two characters are, I said these words before and now I'm struggling with them, Philomathes and Estimian, which they're asked. Estimian is the one asking the questions, like, I'm really curious as to about this, and we're going to call him Phil. Phil is the one that's helped with witch hunting and helped with questioning, so he's significantly more knowledgeable in this subject. So these two go back and forth, and he divides it into 3 books. This is like a 70 to an 80 page book. It's not that long. But in that, there's 3 sections, we'll call them that. And each one kind of goes over different topics. They cover magic, again, sorcery, witchcraft, demons and their classes, which was kind of unique for the time. Most people in demonology didn't poke at classes of demons, but he did. And they also talk about dark magic and what does it mean to be white magic versus black magic. Phil pretty much is like, it's all dark, don't use it. So there's that. They even reference the fairies in the last section, I believe it is. But this is the full English edition. And I want to, like I said, I want to compare it to the Old English because I love that style of writing. But where was I at? Just lost my notes. This version is really easy to read, especially if you're not used to the these, the thous, the thus saiths, and all the thiths that go along with it. And the weird spellings that go along with the Old English stuff is a little complicated. That's one of the reasons that I'm pointing to this one more so than the other one, because the other one, like I said, it's got all the weird spellings, which is fun but not easy to read. from what I could gather of looking at other people's resources that have compared the two, nothing was really changed, which is good. It's just brought into more English, brought into more modern language. I can't even talk. So James jabs at the papacy a lot in this text, and I think I had some I put bookmarks in here and I forgot to underline where I was marking. Talks about who is going to be who may be free from the devilish practices, like who's protected from it. And it's basically no man ought to presume so far as to promise any impunity to himself. Only God has that authority. But they talk about how God permits the wickedness of the people and different folklores of different countries. It's like I said, there's a lot there. Where I had, oops, I'm a train wreck. Sorry, it's a live stream. Can't edit that too easily. There's one section in here specific to witch hunting that I was wanting to poke out. In the third book, there is the fourth section, is the description of the demoniacs and possessed and what the papists may have power to cure them. And this is where they start to discuss who can actually remove a demon, who can actually reverse a curse. And they do talk about certain people within the church who have faith that can do it, but not so much the papacy itself. So it's one of those, like, people have high enough spiritual energy, prayers, connection to God, source divine, but it doesn't have to be a bishop, priest, cardinal, or the Pope himself, because those ones don't always have the best interests at heart for humanity. The trials and the punishments of the witches. This was the stuff that James actually believed in. So one of them asks, to make an end to our conference, since I say it draws late, what form of punishment thinks you merit these magicians and witches? For I see that you account them to be all guilty. Didn't matter who you are, light, dark, didn't matter. All bad. The other one responds, they ought to be put to death according to the law of God, the civil and imperial law and the municipal law of all Christian nations. What kind of death are we talking about here? It's commonly used fire, but that is an indifference to the things being used in every country according to law or custom. So it doesn't matter where you're at, death is the only response as far as these guys were concerned. But ought no age, sex, or rank be exempted? Are you a king? Are you a pauper? Are you a man? Are you a woman? Are you 2 years old? Or are you 50? The answer is none at all, being so used by the lawful magistrate for the highest point of idolatry, wherein no exception is admitted by the laws of God. This is where some of the stuff that makes me super angry comes from. They were okay with killing children, and I'm saying it out loud, because they thought they were witches. How does a 2-year-old know what witchcraft is? Stop this nonsense. Thankfully, it's not happening. Well, not in the way this was happening, but even children are not spared. Not a hair less of my conclusion, for they are not that capable of reason as to practice these things. Basically, if you were taught this by your parents and you keep doing it, you're still guilty. It's one of those things where it's like, that's not cool. But most of the book is these two talking back and forth, and there's times where you'll have to go back and reread a section because it got so long-winded that you almost forgot what you were reading and what the original question was. James, for being someone who valued literature and writing, could have done just a hair bit better on this, but that's just my opinion. But it is still a really good work. If you've never looked into the book Demonology, I do recommend it. It gives you a different perspective on the person who wrote, not wrote, but wanted this one being written. And it also gives you a little bit more of an idea of some of the more interesting aspects of what was in these guys' heads when they were writing about witchcraft. What was their thought? I mean, the book doesn't go into a lot of the fear-mongering, but it inspires fear. It's talking about, like, digging up corpses and the devil going into a corpse to reanimate it so that it can do inappropriate things with the witch that summoned it, to bring forth more foul spirits, or to send a curse on someone and make a womb barren. And it doesn't go into, like, specifics for spells work, that kind of thing, but it's very broad in how it comes across. It's not, how do I put this nicely? It's not something, if you're like a weak stomach, I wouldn't probably read it, because it's not not for that. But if you're looking at kind of where these people came from and you don't want to go full Malleus Maleficarum, this is a good way to get an idea of what they were thinking without diving into the other aspects, because some of the other works that are out there really get into the torture, the descriptions of torture, and it's not as gentle. This one's actually more for the common person to understand, not a religious scholar with the Inquisitions or anything like that. So basically, in the first section of this, book 1, you would call it, or he'd call it, it's the use of charms, what sacred circles are, conjurations. There's a little bit of astrology, and I use that term very loosely in there. If you're an actual astrologer, this is not going to be anything for you. It also talks about how devils work with man, what kind of contracts, humans I should say, and what kind of contracts you're working with there. When you hop into the second book, it talks a lot more about what is biblically demonic versus what is opinions on demonic, which I do appreciate, because there was a lot of that stuff you look through it and it's like, oh, that's an opinion, no thanks. But then it talks about the differences of magician, sorcerer, witch, and what witchcraft is. Sorcery is generally poisoning. That's where a lot of the original terms go to. Magicians were like the high magic people, the ceremonialists that had the elaborate rituals and summoned spirits that way, and witches were the more common people who did, the sympathetic magic and candles and, tying things to trees. So they go through a little bit of that in there as well to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about when they discuss it later as far as who to condemn. They talk about some curses that go on. They also talk about specific time frames when demons are more likely to appear, whether to witches or to scare people, whatever. And they also, like I said, the last section is where you get into the more of what to do, the illusions, the concept of possession is talked about in the third section. And it's an interesting way. It's not like, oh, possession just happens. They actually describe, like, the witch has to make the agreement with the devil to do X number of acts for the witch, at which point the accused witch would let the devil into her body or his body, and they would allow the demon to run rampant for a time. Then the demon would leave. The witch would, request certain other actions in exchange for being possessed again. And it's a different way of looking at possession, I'll just put it that way. So there's even a short little blurb through there, a short blurb, it's like a page long, about the concept of succubi and incubi, what the purpose is, and it's nothing good. It's always maleficent and it's terrible, and I mean, they're not good. Succubi and incubi aren't good things anyway, but the way they describe it makes it even worse. Like, ew, gross. So there's a lot of interesting things in that book, even though it's only a short little text. And when you look at the Old King James and the New King James Bible, and you realize this book has helped build the foundation of a lot of the modern world, done some damage as well, because it's what happens when you put religion in politics. But King James has a much broader history than what even I realized. Like, I knew he had something to do with the Bible. I didn't realize it was the same person did demonology. And when you start to really look into it, he was one of the first people to really start to pull England together, or the UK. But he did it in a way that didn't require a lot of aggression. Don't get me wrong, there were some battles in there. But it was done under the guise of peace, logic, and reason for the most part. It's kind of an interesting blip in history, especially since he was on the throne officially, not as given as a baby, for about 35-40 years. He got a lot done, and he inspired a lot as well. So again, this was just talking about the demonology part and witchcraft, but there's a lot more to him, so I recommend checking him out if you like history, especially if you like the intrigue of like the, I don't know, it's been Game of Thrones is the one my friends keep talking about, so I'm assuming that. So with that, I will let everybody go. Have a great rest of your night, and I will see you in the next video.